Now we move to the next segment of the inaugural session and are honored to welcome Professor Lindsay G. Oades for his keynote address titled Wellbeing Literacy, a language use capability relevant to positive psychology interventions. Dr. Lindsay G. Oades is an internationally acclaimed, multi-award winning researcher, educator, and author in the field of well-being science. He currently serves as Deputy Dean and Professor of Wellbeing Science at the Faculty of Education, University of Melbourne, Australia's top-ranked university and now 14th globally. A coordinating lead author on a UNESCO assignment exploring the connection between education and human flourishing, Dr. Oades received an Australian government citation in 2013 for his outstanding contribution to student learning. As a thought-provoking speaker, he has delivered keynote and invited talks in 18 countries. In 2022, he was appointed Associate Dean at the Melbourne Graduate School of Education, with over 165 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters, and 5 books published by leading publishers, including Cambridge University Press, Wiley-Blackwell, Routledge, and Sage. Dr. Oades is also a scientific reviewer for the Australian Research Council. We are truly grateful to have you here with us today. We now invite Dr. Pulkit Khanna to chair this session. Dr. Pulkit Khanna is a professor of psychology and dean at the Jindal Institute of Behavioral Sciences, OP Jindal Global University, where she oversees academic planning and management. With a PhD in psychology from Indian Institute of Technology, Delhi, and certification in positive psychology from NIMHANS, she brings a rich blend of academic, training, and industry experience. A founding member and executive committee member of the National Positive Psychology Association, Dr. Khanna's research focuses on student well-being and indigenous practices that promote positive psychological growth. Her work emphasizes psychological interventions for human flourishing, particularly in educational settings. She has presented at leading forums like the International Positive Psychology Association and the Templeton Foundation's Science for Monks, and has published widely in international peer-reviewed journals. Her supervision spans doctoral and graduate theses on topics such as post-traumatic growth, psycho-spiritual interventions, and traditional education systems. We are really grateful to have you here with us today, ma'am. Over to you.
Thank you, Purnima. Good morning to everybody. A very warm welcome to Professor Lindsay Oades, and greetings to our NPPA President, Professor Vimla Veeraraghavan. It was a pleasure to listen to you earlier this morning, ma'am. And greetings also to Professor Kamlesh Singh, our Secretary of NPPA. Thank you both for your insightful addresses that set the tone for the next 2 days. I am particularly delighted to be able to participate in this session where Professor Lindsay Oades brings to you his global message of well-being literacy. And I am very honored to share with you that, of course, I've followed his work over the years, and I've had the privilege to meet him on more than a few occasions. And what has touched me is the wit and wisdom with which he talks of well-being literacy. I do sincerely hope that he brings that across to you from across the continents through the internet, to all of you tuned in to listen to him. I must not stand between you and our keynote speaker. So I truly sincerely look forward to your address, Professor Oades, and then bringing open the audience questions and interaction at the end of your session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Khanna. Lovely to be back in India, even though I'm not in India. I wish I could be with you all directly but sincerely wonderful to spend time with everyone today. I have been probably to India 8 or 9 times in the last 3 years, and very appreciate the comments from Professor Singh as well in terms of EDIC and EMIC, which sort of heartens some of the things I'm going to try to talk about. And Professor Khanna, that was a big call that I have to be witty as well as use something useful. So I will do my best. I believe, Professor Khanna, that somebody was going to do the slides. Is that correct?
Purnima, would you be helping with Professor Lindsay's slide?
Sure. Just a moment.
If we could please go full screen. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Purnima. So in the time we have today, I do want to talk about wellbeing literacy and formally a language use capability, and in this context, talk specifically about their relevance to positive psychology interventions. And following on from Professor Singh's comments, how do we make these approaches culturally and linguistically relevant? So Purnima, if I could go to the next slide, please.
Sure, just a moment.
So what I want to cover today in the time we have, firstly, what is wellbeing literacy? So some attempt at defining that and telling you a little story about where it came from and why I think it's worth exploring. Then more formally, I'll talk about the capability model of wellbeing literacy. And I will talk also about some preliminary attempts at measurement of wellbeing literacy with a real request and then imploring people to think about how else could we do this in different ways, both relevant to context and culture. And I'll finish with some examples of some current research we're doing in this area and aspirations for future research. And you will see a few photos of my previous trips to India, which will come up on the screen. That former one there was in Mumbai, but more importantly, relevant to wellbeing literacy. Obviously, it's a festival, which you know well, but the use of colour as a form of expression and the communicative aspects there are just one of the many examples of broadening the way we think about language use and literacy, which I will cover as we work through. All right, and then we'll go to the next one. Thank you. All right, so in terms of the formal definition of wellbeing literacy, there's 2 ways of doing this. We can do the formal first, and then I'll do the summary second. So the formal definition that we are working with and have published multiple pieces with and several people are working on, wellbeing literacy is defined as a capability to comprehend and compose wellbeing language across contexts, and importantly, with the intention of using such language to maintain or improve the wellbeing of oneself or others. And you could say the world, but we'll stay with the personal and impersonal at the moment. The summary way of talking about that is how we communicate about and for wellbeing. And this, of course, in terms of what we've heard in terms of EDIC and EMIC, these issues, immediately the question becomes wellbeing defined by whom and how is it defined? So a couple of papers, these are just a couple of example papers that I'm drawing from today. One of the original theoretical papers, capability model for wellbeing science and practice, which outlines in theoretical detail some of the work I'm talking about. And the second paper there, published in the Journal of Positive Psychology, which you may have seen or have access to, does a similar thing, but specific to today's comments, really explores this idea of how most or all positive psychology interventions, at least as they get called in some of the dominant literature in the West, they all use language. So there's a set of capabilities that's required for all of the positive psychology interventions. And I'm interested in what are the common factors and what are the common language capabilities of the way we communicate about and for wellbeing, irrespective of whether it's a gratitude intervention or a strengths intervention or self-regulation intervention. What are the language use components of those issues and those interventions, and how do they vary across context and across culture, and how does that intersect with language? So that's the sort of broad rationale from a scientific point of view. From a more practical point of view, where did wellbeing literacy come from? For me personally, I've originally trained as a clinical psychologist, so I've worked in health context, liaised with government, health departments in government, and now I also am more in an educational context in a faculty of education, surrounded by literacy learners and educators. And what struck me was, even though both of these endeavours and both of these systems and groups of people were interested in wellbeing, they're actually doing things very, very differently. If you say wellbeing alone, often that will the health department of governments will be held responsible for that. If you say literacy, the education department. So within a government framework, there's shifting of costs in these areas. I was interested in joining the two and actually thinking of wellbeing through a literacy learning lens, and that's how this idea came to be. If you move to our next slide, please. So I'm going to take us through a little journey. This is a visual representation of the capability model of wellbeing literacy. And we won't spend long on this other than to say there's 5 things really that build up the capability model. And as you can see there from top left, vocabulary and knowledge, then the issue of adapting to context, the issue of the intention of our communication, and comprehending, that is listening, reading and viewing, or what would be known commonly as receptive language use, and then composing, speaking, writing and creating. So these are the 5 components of the capability model of wellbeing literacy. And I'm very happy to be talking about capability because I know I'm in a country where Amartya Sen originates from. And so what we've tried to do is take some of Amartya Sen's ideas about that capability, what we're able to be and do, and apply it to literacy learning in the service of well-being. And in that regard, a lot of the positive psychological constructs really become issues of language use. They refer to something, of course, but we're actually looking at the language use components of it. So, for example, many positive psychology people will be familiar with character strengths and the classification of character strengths. From a wellbeing literacy point of view, that is a set of vocabulary. It's a set of things that people can communicate about and for in the service of wellbeing. And that's just one example of the intersection between traditional positive psychology ideas and viewing it through a language use lens. So if we go to the next slide, I will walk you through the components of this model. When you say literacy, people usually hear vocabulary. But importantly, literacy is language use, which includes, but is not limited to vocabulary. It's not limited to just vocal language. However, the reason I start with this is the part which which is the most tangible to many people. They can get the idea of words, and they can get the idea that words refer to things, and therefore have knowledge about them. However, one of the core ideas here is people from different places, of course. Positive psychology has some of its origins in North America and the English-speaking world, but there are many other ways of construing and thinking of well-being, as Professor Singh mentioned. But also lay people, that is non-experts, have views of what is well-being, and they also have theories about how their own well-being could be improved, or when they feel better, feel worse, function better, function worse. So the idea of both lay concepts and lay theories is really important. So the vocabulary and the language constructions that people bring to well-being is at the heart of this idea. Really importantly, as I've said, literacy, language use is much more than vocabulary. However, while we stay at vocabulary, it's interesting to examine some of that work and what many people have look at our vocabularies for both illness or ill-being and well-being. And we do know that many people, many disciplines, many professions have a greater number of words, literally, for things which are negatively valent than they do for things that are positively valent. So, for example, we might have depression, anxiety, sadness, anger, things which we might construe or define as negatively valent, as opposed to many of the things in terms of the positive aspects of experiences which relate to constructing the idea of well-being. So it's not a claim that we should just have positive words. It's a recognition that possibly because of the negativity bias, our propensity to pay more attention to negative events than positive events, likely to do with survival in an evolutionary sense. This is part of our vocabulary. So one aspect of that is thinking about what choices might we have if we had other words to use to construct our experiences. And as I've already mentioned, positive education, the idea of character strengths, working with character strengths, signature strengths, those sort of ideas from Peterson and Seligman's work on virtue ethics, that can be considered as a set of language tools as much as a set of psychological and philosophical ideas. So first part of the model, vocabulary and knowledge. I will say to draw from some of the philosophers of language, like Ludwig Wittgenstein, his work, the meaning of a word varies depending on the context in which it's used. So this is the intersection with some of the intercultural theme of this conference, which we will work through. If we could go to the next slide, please. So coming to the second and third parts of the capability model of wellbeing literacy, comprehending and composing. For those of you who have worked in language and communication contexts, you may also note that you have receptive. Comprehending is akin or similar to what gets called receptive language use, and composing is more of the expressive language use. So these come in three pairs, listening and speaking, and then the traditional view of literacy, reading and writing, in some languages such as Spanish, alfabetismo, as the definition of literacy. Traditionally, the more cognitive and more older versions of what literacy is, it was reduced to reading and writing. The more contemporary views of literacy are both multimodal, that is, they're using multiple modes of language use to be literate, and also that literacy is seen as more of a socio-cultural phenomenon, meaning not something that lives inside the head as a cognitive issue, but a cultural practice that occurs between people in the way they communicate and express shared beliefs through cultural practices with the aid of language. So viewing, digital technology is dominant. So I'm not sure emojis or visual images used in digital technology to symbolize emotions are an example of viewing things other than words. Creating can come in many forms, creating visual art, creating music, and then listening to music. So this model of literacy, which actually is drawn from literacy learning in the Australian curriculum, there's 6 areas, and is similar to many contemporary literacy learning approaches around the world. That's where it comes from. So the key message here is these are skills that people learn, which is literacy learning. How do we use this framework to apply it to how we can communicate both about wellbeing and in the service of wellbeing? So that is what we're trying to do here. The other thing this does is it gets us to think about the cultural things that we do. We've got the wonderful intellectual and cultural history of India does give us a great smorgasbord of options of cultural things that people can do that will improve their wellbeing. Wellbeing literacy is interested in what's the language and communicative components to those cultural practices, and how can we help people do those intentionally. That's what we're interested here, which is a different question than how can we develop a positive psychology intervention and then implement it in the way that we hear about interventions implemented, particularly in a health or medical narrative where we intervene in something, usually to get rid of something that we don't want. This frame is a different frame because language is ubiquitous, it's everywhere, it's part of both our formal life, our professional life, but also our natural life in home in other contexts. And that's why it's a very good lever for us to be thinking about wellbeing and the many positive psychological constructs we use as language tools. And that's part of what we're doing here. If I could move to the next slide, please. So building up, there's more to this than solely having a lot of vocabulary about things to do with wellbeing. There's more to it than just having a set of skills to communicate about and for wellbeing. But of course, not only culture, but context. We use language differently. If you don't believe me, would you speak to your child in the same way you speak to your boss? Would you use the same language and style of communicating with your boss compared to with a friend, etc.? They're different roles, which you can see there in the diagram: partner, teacher, friend. We communicate differently to different people. So that ability to adapt our language use, if we want to be cognitive about it, how do we self-regulate our language use, or what metacognition do we have about our language? That's one way of thinking about it. All of this is related to our wellbeing and the wellbeing of those with whom we are communicating. We see this a lot in organisational contexts, in the way that junior staff may be spoken to by senior staff, and we see great differences in cultural norms about what's an acceptable way to communicate in different cultures, depending on power hierarchies and assumptions. However, in general, the use of language for the sake of wellbeing is a capability which underpins many of our positive psychology interventions. So adaptation to context, we're moving to the more high-level skills. We're moving to the things that we're learning like artificial intelligence and the old, what was used to be referred to as the frame problem, adapt to context. The same for humans. Some of us are better at than others at adapting the way we communicate depending on where we are. However, we're not just talking about literacy and communication skills in general. We're only talking about the aspects that are about and for wellbeing, which becomes harder to define as you see if you work through. If we can move to the next slide, please. So this brings us to the fifth or first, depending on which way you want to work through the model, but a fifth part of the capability model of wellbeing literacy. A quick way to think about this is the idea, for shorthand, you might call this mindful language use. What's our intention of the way we are communicating? Both what vocabulary might we be using if it's vocal communication? What mode are we using? Are we writing? Are we singing? Are we seeing a person face to face rather than communicating on email or WhatsApp? But importantly, the idea of intentionality. So language doesn't use itself. Language has a user. That language use occurs in a context, and the language user has an intention. So the intentionality, the idea of developing the capability so that people can use language in a way which is beneficial to themselves, their own well-being, beneficial to the person they're speaking with, or you can think of this at a more systemic or organizational level. What is the language system in an organization? What is the set of language use between people in an organization or in a school? And is it well-being enabling? So this also picks up on things that we already know. We know about issues with self-talk, issues like cognitive behavior therapy, about how we communicate in language, in our thinking. It has elements of that in it as well. So the more you look at it, the more you can see it's a very pervasive. It can have a lot of relevance and applications, but at the same time, it has boundaries. We are talking about the intentional part of language use. We are talking about things that can be accepted as really the aspect of things that are relevant to well-being, or modes of communication that are intentionally done in the service of well-being. Empirical researchers will immediately ask, well, how do we operationalise that? And I would say, absolutely, that's a very good question. We need to do it in different ways, in different contexts and cohorts. And that's part of the challenge of a large formal model like this, but also the opportunities of its multiple applications in different contexts, cohorts and cultures. If we go to the next slide. Okay, for those of you who prefer tables to pretty pictures, this is another way of summarising the key components of the capability model of wellbeing literacy. So to quickly repeat what I've covered, but in a tabular form, starting with remember how we communicate about and for wellbeing. The about part is the vocabulary and the knowledge. That is, in this case, words that signify something. So self-regulation signifies something as a word. Optimism signifies something. The strengths signify something. So it's that denotative or signifying aspect of language. So it's not just having lots of words and lots of knowledge. It's that these words and this set of knowledge that those words refer to make up the pool of resources that the person has that they can use to communicate. A person can communicate through speaking, writing and creating, listening, reading and viewing. But how are they doing that intentionally in the service of wellbeing, and how are they varying it by context? So that is the model that picks up on the what, how, where, who, when and why of the capability of language use. That is, what are the choices the person has about and for wellbeing through the way they're using language, and that's what makes it a capability model. The agency is coming from the choices in the way they're constructing their language. The other assumption here is the language doesn't just only reflect reality, but it also can construct aspects of reality. If you think of some of our classic psychological models and theories, cognitive psychology has the root metaphor of information processing, the mind as a computer. A lot of Freudian psychology has the metaphor or analogy of aspects of emotions as a pressure cooker or steam boiler, hence catharsis. And I could go on. You can find root metaphors or key analogies to make the non-physical aspects of the psychological world seem more physical through analogy, which underscores the constructive power of language and its use in impacting upon our well-being or the well-being of others. If we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so sorry, if we just go back to the pretty pictures. So that one, yeah. So just to take you back, I've tracked you through the 5 components. People will argue about which one's more important or in what order they come. I usually present them vocabulary first because that's tangible. Then I go to the skills, and I go to what I call the higher order issues of sensitivity to context and intentionality. However, some educators who I've been working with lately want to present it in the other way because they want to think about intentionality first and the context they're in, who they're working with, then the skills, and then vocabulary learning. That is up to the practitioner in the more meaningful way that they choose to use those components. Okay, if we could keep going on, please. Coming to the issue of measurement, and when I say measurement, I'm like probably many people here trained in the psychology tradition. However, if we're in an education context, people will use terms like assessment, and there are different ways of thinking about that. But firstly, going with measurement, as I'll talk about in a moment, we developed a self-report scale, which was used particularly in a sample of about 80,000 students in South Australia, in Adelaide, South Australia. But also the idea is wellbeing literacy isn't just for students. It doesn't just exist in education context. It's more of a public health concept. We all nearly all of us use language to communicate. Nearly all of us value well-being. So it is a concept that can be applied in many contexts, be it in formal education contexts from Anganwadi or early childhood through to foundational, secondary, tertiary education. Parents communicate with their children. For those of you who are married, you communicate with your partner about and for well-being every day, probably. So it is a ubiquitous set of applications, and the challenge is how can we do this? One of the reasons I've been so attracted to this area is because language use is ubiquitous, it's everywhere. It's a great lever to generate change for population-based wellbeing, in my view. To go with the theme of this conference in terms of cultural and intercultural aspects applied to positive psychology, my former PhD student, Dr. Lindsay G, did a study on university student wellbeing, but particularly looking at the Chinese international students, of which we have many in Australia, and many Chinese students travel internationally as well, and we have, of course, we have many Indian students as well. So these intercultural ideas in terms of what their constructions of wellbeing are, what do they actually construe wellbeing to be? How is it similar or different than issues of mental health and mental illness? And how do they use language in those constructions? So Lindsay's work included interviewing Chinese students both in English and in Mandarin, and included examining the different constructions of wellbeing depending on whether they were communicating in English or in Mandarin, which taps into some of the language aspects of wellbeing, but also if we're going to do not only medical interventions for mental illness, if we're going to do wellbeing education broadly defined, that is the challenge of culturally sensitive positive psychology or culturally sensitive wellbeing education more broadly, which is becoming increasingly important as the world becomes increasingly globally mobile. In the education world, increasing transnational education occurring. We'll go to our next slide. Okay, so one endeavour, and there's some publications on this, one example of how to measure issues like concept or construct like wellbeing literacy. We used a scale. Dr. Han Chao Hu, who is a former PhD student with me, we developed a scale called the WellLit 6, which is familiar to psychologists, a self-report scale. I won't go into the psychometrics of it, but it is a reliable and valid scale. It's currently in English, Turkish, French, Mandarin, and almost published in Portuguese as well. I don't believe we've done Hindi or any of the other Indian languages yet. So put simply, it really is a self-report scale about some of the key elements of the wellbeing literacy model. I have many words I can think of to communicate about wellbeing. I know a lot about wellbeing. I know how to improve my wellbeing. I have the skills to understand information about wellbeing. I have the skills to express myself about wellbeing. And number 6 there, I can communicate about it in multiple ways. So we have used this with students down to the age of 15 through to their parents, adults, and we've started using it in organisations. This is just one attempt of this approach in terms of measuring aspects of wellbeing literacy. And of course, it has all the limitations of a self-report scale. And one thing we need to do is develop many other ways of approaching this. One thing I often ask people to have a think about their own wellbeing literacy. How would you answer those questions? And for those of you who have a romantic partner or a husband or a wife, girlfriend, boyfriend, whatever, how would you answer to them? And then you start to think about what's the wellbeing literacy ecology in your own relationship. Once again, this was developed in an English-speaking Australian context. I'm sure absolutely there are different and better ways of doing this. conceptually, I believe this can travel across nations and cultures. From a measurement perspective, I think we need to develop different measures and tools which are more relevant to the language environments and cultural beliefs that we're doing it in. And there's your epidemic playing right out in terms of measurement. If I could go to the next slide, please. I want to finish, and I'm keen to leave opportunities to have some questions and discussion. I want to give you a few examples of current research that we are doing. Working with PhD student Lisa Baker, who is currently looking at applying or understanding wellbeing literacy in early childhood education in an Australian context. I've had the great pleasure of visiting some of the Anganwadi contexts near Bengaluru and a couple of other places in India. And I'm aware that is a major public policy or a policy initiative of the Indian government at the moment about developing and improving early childhood education. One of the things that Lisa's work is doing is looking at how the early childhood teachers or educators construe and use language about wellbeing, and also looking at the children and the way they're using language in the service of wellbeing. And this may not translate that well into the Indian culture, but I'll give you the example. In terms of self-regulation skills of the young children, so we're talking 4-year-olds perhaps, phrases like "be the boss of my own body" is something in Australia that you'll hear that an early childhood educator might use as a way of expressing that self-regulation, that ability to calm oneself down or whatever's needed. So that aspect is one example of applications of this approach. The early feedback we're getting from the early childhood educators is that they're finding the model very useful to be more intentional about the way that they're thinking about wellbeing in their everyday interactions with young children. One method development that we've done from that work is a tool called the WellMet, which we will present at the forthcoming International Positive Psychology Association conference, which is in Brisbane in Australia in July. And that is a qualitative equivalent that is taking vignettes of language interactions between a teacher and student, parent and child, whatever it may be. In this case, it was teacher and young student, child, and thinking about what those components, the 5 components, to make sense of what's happening in the service of wellbeing in the language interactions. We're working with number 3, we're working with another student whose name is Luli, and Lou is working on a wellbeing literacy model of social media use. Right now, certainly in Australia, we're hearing a lot of challenges of social media use or social media misuse that's certainly damaging to young people and adults. So we're looking at, well, if it was being used well by its users and it was wellbeing enhancing, what would be happening? And that's part of the work that Lou is working on. We're also looking at further validation of the WellLit 6, just about to publish the Portuguese version and other things. That's imperfect, like all science, that's imperfect, but we're at least looking at it across context to see if we can improve it. Another example, there are many, but I'm just trying to give you some examples of how this is starting to gather interest from people. Developing an artificial intelligence coach for wellbeing literacy. So my colleague, Dr. Simon Coulomb, who is based in Quebec in Canada, we're trying to collaborate on when I say try, we're still looking for more funding to do this, an artificial intelligence coach to help you, give you some guidance on the communication mechanisms, similar to some of the chatbots or things we have already, but exploring the technological ideas. Where we would like to go, that's sort of that last one, number 5, is sort of current and future. We're just starting. A few ideas to finish with about where we could or should go. Next slide. I apologise for the very large bit of text on this slide. This was done as an add-on, as I was thinking about. I need to talk more about the future. So here we are. So those of you who are strong, quantitatively oriented people with researchers, the obvious thing we need to do very soon is some structural equation modelling to start to look at the relationship of those 5 components. And importantly, whether wellbeing literacy mediates or moderates other positive psychology interventions. So, for example, if you are going to do let's take a character strengths intervention in a workplace, does a person who already has better language use and intentional use of their language, do they get differential gains from such an intervention compared to a person with say a lower level of wellbeing literacy? We're actually looking not wellbeing literacy as an intervention in itself, but possibly as a moderator, because language use is so basic. Possibly this capability is a moderator of all of our other interventions that we're talking about. Number 2 really is, if we think about this as a capability, there's something we can learn and get better at and use and reuse. How can we develop it as a formal assessment? How could it be part of a standard or regular something that is assessed, for example, in educational contexts? So a teacher of 16 or 14-year-olds in a school context, in many ways it makes more sense to hold the teacher or the school responsible for improving a student's wellbeing literacy than it does holding them responsible for improving their wellbeing. The reason I say that is we know that so many other things impact on a student's or a person's wellbeing that we shouldn't hold the teacher responsible for. However, given that wellbeing literacy is teachable, learnable, and a capability, I see its application as a very important capability building option for education systems. So rather than us thinking about let's put a bit of positive psychology into schools, it's how do we develop the capability in general to communicate about and for wellbeing using culturally appropriate language that relates to our positive psychological constructs. Another example, similar to number 1, put simply, how do these variables relate to other positive psychology concepts? We already do have some preliminary correlations between wellbeing literacy and wellbeing, and that is heartening, because if we can manipulate wellbeing literacy, therefore we may be able to have an impact on wellbeing. So that is exactly that. Excuse me. Future research to explore. And finally, and to loop back to where we started and the theme of this conference, one of the things, if you talk to sociologists, which I do quite a bit, they will criticise aspects of positive psychology and positive psychology interventions, or PPIs, as they're often called, as being technicist. They're decontextualised summaries of techniques that we can do and maybe a little superficial. And I would argue I'm kind of sympathetic to some elements of that critique and argue we have thousands of years of cultural traditions, singing, dancing, listening, creating the things that we do together. What are the language components of those? And what can we learn from them to make our approaches more both contextually and culturally bound in the real life, real world, in the service of well-being. And that is related to the theme of this conference, because they will look different in different places. However, conceptually, from an ethics perspective, they may be similar at the broad level. So, for example, the term well-being conceptually may ethically be a concept which we can compare things across the world. However, how we realise well-being, how we do that as practice, how we language it, can and will be very different depending on context. And they are the challenges of a global well-being science. If we go to our final slide, I think it is. Yeah, just final slide before we hand back to Professor Kana to see if we want to explore questions. This is it is a promotion of a book, but I'll tell you the reason for that. Later this year, or literally in a week, we send this off to the publisher. But importantly, it was an attempt to build the community of people interested in wellbeing literacy. So this book will be forthcoming, around 25 chapters from international authors, examining both the research and practice applications of wellbeing literacy. So this is very generative because this is still early work. What could it mean for schools, workplaces? So people are working on workplace wellbeing literacy, policy, inclusive language, and so diversity and inclusion. What are the language uses in that type of work? Coaching for wellbeing literacy, the impact of it for parenting, and we have some work in an Australian context in Indigenous community mental health, and we have some early examples of cross-cultural wellbeing literacy with some of our collaborators in Indonesia. So just to illustrate some of the potential applications of this work. And the very final slide, please. This is just about questions. If you want to contact me, email, but I know you probably do WhatsApp, so that's fine. Email is probably better for me because it comes into my work. And also, if you want to join me on LinkedIn, there's a G in the middle of my name, and very happy to connect. We do have a lot of Indian friends on LinkedIn already, but I'd love to have more so we can keep the conversation going. Thank you, and I will hand back to my good friend, Professor Kana.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Oades. That was indeed a wonderful keynote address. We now open the house to questions from the audience. If you have a question or a comment, please leave it on the chat box so that we can quickly get it across to Lindsay. We still have about 10 minutes in this session, so we would be very happy to take any questions. While we await our first question, Professor Oades, there's something that I'd like to check with you or just understand your views on. I suspect some of the answers might lie in the book that you just spoke to us about on your final slide. But what I've been thinking about throughout your talk is that, is the way forward more global or more local? You do talk about this being, the language of how do you communicate about and for well-being. And I believe that the purpose of any effective communication is to be understood. But when we speak about something like well-being, not only is it going to be different across cultures, it's also different across disciplines. So in an interdisciplinary environment, in a lot of educational spaces, an economist is going to look at well-being very differently from a psychologist, who might see it very differently from a sociologist, and so on. And it doesn't stop there. Even if you look at ages, across generations, how people speak about well-being, the choice of words they associate with it are so different. So in short, my question to you really is that, is the way forward going to be more universal, more general, or super specific, super local, with very unique vocabularies, very unique ways of discussing well-being that perhaps cannot even be translated?
Thank you. That's a wonderful question. I'll have an attempt at answering it. So I'll put forth an answer. It's not necessarily the best answer. My background, you would have heard, was psychology, but probably there's a part of my background that wasn't mentioned, and that is philosophy as well. And the reason that's relevant is I'm quite influenced by Anna Alexandrova's work on the philosophy of science for wellbeing, and she uses a three-part way of thinking about that, or a hierarchical. I don't have a slide in front of me, but firstly, concept at the top, secondly, differential realization, and thirdly, at the bottom, context. And why that's relevant is, from a philosophical point of view, the concept of well-being at a concept level is the same across nations. So in the same way, if we think about the term hot, hot probably means the same thing in India as it does in Australia. But the differential realization, so how we differentially realize, in what different ways do we realize or achieve well-being, might be very different for individuals. So that's the second level. And then the third level, or the third part of Anna Alexandrova's work, is contextualization. So basically the idea that we shouldn't really say anything without making a or say anything philosophically or scientifically without making a reference to context. So to draw out the question, I'm basically saying it's both. At a concept level, I believe we can conceptualize something and say that is what well-being is. At a differential realization level, people will say there's different ways they do it. And then to keep a caveat, we take a context. Of course, if we're talking about language use here, then the meaning of words and the meaning of the way language is used is going to be very different. But conceptually, we can still talk about well-being. So one of the important things, I think, is actually going to different language communities and asking them what their conception is of well-being, and listening to the language they're using to construct well-being. And of course, you have that classic tension, philosophical tension between universalism and particularism, for want of a better word. So trying to generalize, which is what scientists like to do. Sociologists and certain people in humanities will want to take a very local and contextual, unique view. I think from a language point of view, we can very, very localize. But the philosopher in me tells me that we can still have a unifying concept whilst recognizing that people realize it differently and it will vary by context. And that's not necessarily a problem. So if we take a scientific measurement point of view, we already do have different measures for different cohorts. We might have different measures for different contexts. We already do that in social science and psychological science. So I don't necessarily see we have to have either or. I think we need to take it in both. So just the final point would, at a concept level, think about when you utter the word hot. Does hot mean the same everywhere, or does it mean a different thing? So some people might say, or chili pepper hot is hot, or burn in the shower hot is hot. Conceptually, they're still hot. They're just differential. You realise by whether you're eating a pepper or whether you're in the shower, but you still have this concept of hot. I would argue you still have a concept of well-being, and then you can go about comparing different ways. One of the things that often happens in the wellbeing literacy presentations is people say, "Oh, but what's your operational definition of wellbeing?" And I say, "Well, we'll come to that when we've defined our cohort and our context, but we can still stay at the concept level, which will enable us to have a more global conversation." It doesn't neglect that you have variations by context. So there we go. I did it. I don't know how well I did book it, and apologies if I didn't use wit, but I did my best.
No, you did great. Thank you. Thank you so much. That was very helpful. I will quickly hop on to our audience questions. I do realize we have the last few minutes left for this session. So Dr. Prachi is asking if there's any difference between capacity building programs and capability building programs.
In the context of wellbeing literacy, we use capability to recognize, in the same way that, say, Amita Sen's work does, to recognize the fact that language use is interaction with an environment, and so you're capable if the environment affords certain opportunities, or Amita Sen language functionings or realized capability. But in terms of, I think there's some strong parallels between social and emotional learning and the self-regulatory emphasis of social and emotional learning and aspects of the wellbeing literacy model. Obviously, the wellbeing literacy is emphasising the language use components of it. And sometimes when we say wellbeing literacy, people hear emotional literacy, and they'll ask, what's the difference between emotional literacy and wellbeing literacy? My simple answer is wellbeing involves more than emotions. So I'm a strong supporter of the emotional literacy work. I think it's excellent, important, but there are other aspects to wellbeing, as we know, than emotions. So I've kind of answered that question. I've said there's some big similarities, but there are also some differences. And we have a particular view of how we use the word capability, because we're trying to emphasize the interactional components with environments. Sometimes capacity can be individualized and seen as part of an individual. Psychologists are very good at putting things into characteristics into individuals. And so the capability here is just trying to stretch that out to emphasize that it's an interaction with an environment.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. Thank you also for quickly navigating through that window and addressing both questions. I want to take just one moment to sincerely thank you from on behalf of all of us at NPPA. Not only did you address the topic of wellbeing literacy, but what was particularly remarkable was that you left everybody with food for thought. You left us with ideas for where future research could go, and you've given everybody listening with some thoughts about where to take this forward, how they could get associated with such research. So thank you for that. In the interest of time, I will quickly stop here and hand it back to our moderator, Purnima. Thank you.